Well, Scott asked me to come because one of the things I'm into is neuro-linguistic programming. Do you guys know what that is? Do you have any idea what that is?
Something to do with hypnosis, with the spoken word?
In a way, a long time ago, I was real fortunate because I've only been in Georgia like 2 years. I come from California. And I was out there. And these two guys, John Grinder and Richard Bandler, got together up at Stanford, and they're into studying linguistics. And so John was a linguist. Richard was actually a computer programmer and was in communication. And they decided that they would find some of the best therapists in the world they could on tape. And they watched the tape, and when somebody goes, a client would go, oh, they'd run the tape backwards and see if they could figure out what the therapist did to give that response. And then they ran the tape backwards even further to try to find out where he got that information from. And they studied people like Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir, and one of the big ones was Milton Erickson. And Milton Erickson was a medical hypnotist. And so a lot of the patterns come from there. And they would then decide that they would try to code the information so that you could actually figure out the hows of things. And to me, that's like the fascinating piece about NLP. NLP is just like one of the tools in my bag of tricks as a therapist, because that's the orientation I come in from. Is for 30 years I've just worked hardcore child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assaults, addictions. That's my specialty. So, for lack of a better word, if you don't get into some set of skills on how, it's real funny because sometimes when I'm working with people, especially in addiction or recovery, they'll say, well, so-and-so's not ready. They're just not ready with their addiction. And I say, what is it? They're not ready, or they don't believe it's possible and they don't know how yet. And everybody just kind of looks at me and goes, what? And I says, first, do they believe it's possible? Because if you don't believe it's possible, you can't believe it. Secondly, is do they know how? Do you know how to change your mind? And they came down to, Banner and Grinder came down to an actual way of gathering information and encoding the information in such a way that you literally can figure out what you have to do inside your head to change the way you think about things. They were also very, there was a split up between Banner and Grinder. And Bandler was very, very elegant in the way he did things, but I would say very ethical. Richard was a sociopath. Richard and I almost went to the parking lots at one of the trainings because he and I just got into it. I didn't like his sarcasm. I mean, he was like mean with his sarcasm and arrogant with it all. He kind of got the idea that I didn't like it. He said, you want to do something about it? This was back in the 70s. I hadn't been out of the service that long. Like, let's go. So some of his friends talked us down, which was really good because that was the time in life Bandler was known for being high on cocaine and carrying a gun. So if we were to hit the parking lot, he would probably blow me away. But it's a powerful technology. The problem that it often got to be is that they became very technician. People became technicians. Again, the two schools, and when you're kind of like John, very elegant, very laid back with it. So when they split, of course, his group didn't do much. The other group was very, we're the only thing, we had all the right stuff, you guys are all wrong in what you're doing, and we're going to show you how stupid you look. And when you kind of come in with that approach, people get really oppositional, and they decide, well, we're just going to shut you down, shut you out. But the technology persists. And so even though it came from hypnosis, and there's a lot of hypnosis that people will do with it, some of the ways I was enriching training is they were separate things. It's really easy to induce a trance using NLP, and it's really easy to induce a trance. But the idea was, can you figure out what people do? Can you code it in such a way that you can learn to do it? Which to me was fascinating. Especially we get talking about, I'm heavily into some of the neurosciences anymore, the neuroplasticity. You guys know what neuroplasticity is? Quite a while ago, we all thought that once your brains are hardwired, they're hardwired. Nothing you can do about that, right? Well, probably close to 20 years ago, they found out that's not true. Once you believe, you can't change it. You don't even bother to try. So you're stuck with it the way it is. Neuroplasticity says, if I slowly and consciously think a certain way, every time I do that, I create a certain neural pathway. The more often I do that, the more often I sink that in, that the brain is actually very plastic. They even come up to how they would say in the old days that you can't, that the brain doesn't reproduce itself. That's not true either. And if you wire your brain a certain way by choice, then when the new brain cells come, they pick up the brain as well. So there's literally ways of changing the way you think about it. In addiction, I'd often say everybody's trying to control the behavior. But what happens if you just see through and you don't want it anymore? The people who almost like spontaneously give up addictions, all of a sudden they kind of just go, they disconnect from it. What I liked about NLP was it gave me a way of understanding how they did that. I had one client come in and we were talking about her alcoholism and stuff like that. So we're talking, you know, and all of a sudden she just goes, yeah, well, I used to have an eating disorder. And she kind of went on and go, wait a minute. You used to have an eating disorder? And she said, yeah. So was it serious? She said, yeah, it's pretty serious. I was in residential treatment a couple of times. I said, but you don't have it anymore. She said, no. I said, well, how'd you do that? I drive all my clients nuts with this phrase called, how do you do that? And she says, well, you know, I thought about it. And one day it just didn't make sense to me anymore. And I go, okay, so what happens if we look at this and this doesn't make sense anymore? She said, well, I'll quit drinking. And I go, okay, let's figure out how to do that. And we did. And it was one of these funny things where when you repattern the brain, you don't have to fight against it because you're not creating it in the first place. I did a big, some friends of mine in California were really big in the anger management programs. And so they would teach all this stuff, and they said, you know, they go, Lynn, will you come and talk? You know, I only get invited once. Because as you get, I'm not politically correct. I don't hold a lot of punches. I know what I believe and what I've seen work. And it doesn't work for everybody, and that's cool. But it seems to work for me, so I come. And they give me this really nice introduction. I literally grew up in the streets of Detroit. I'm an ex-biker, I'm a combat vet. I'm an ex-junkie, okay? So they give me this nice introduction. They say, Lynn, we understand you used to have quite a temper. It's kind of, you have no idea. Especially in hard liquor, I'd get mean. They go, but you're pretty mellow these days. And they go, how do you control your anger? And I go, well, I just don't create it to begin with. And I sat down. And everybody goes, what? And I said, well, if you don't create the anger, I don't have to control it. So I found that there were patterns. And in NLP, we hear that phrase out, there are patterns. We all get patterned. You know, I grew up in an alcoholic family. I grew up in a violent neighborhood. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in Detroit. So of course I was patterned to be violent and to be a junkie. That's just kind of what everybody did. So I just fell in with everybody, and I did it. And then I ran across some people who said, you know, you don't have to keep doing it that way. But see, that sounds easy, right? But how do you do that? What are the little mechanisms, the little pictures? That's always kind of the little things, the little specific things that can make a difference, that you can actually change the way you think, which actually change your neural pathways, which actually changes your life. And you get to keep the change. Because you finally see through them. You literally see them differently. So NLP was one of these really turning points in my life. And though I don't particularly care for a lot of the people in it because of their ethics and they're just technicians. See, I'd rather teach people how to use NLP with themselves than to manipulate people. Because I just don't find that ethical. Outside of that little context in which I have permission as a therapist, I have permission to help people change. I don't have your permission to change your lives tonight. I don't have my wife's permission, so I don't go home and try to change who she is. Because she doesn't like that. Well, I found that people don't like that. So I actually spend some time in my own therapy contextualizing my skills. So that in what area do I have permission? I can't not see it, you know, what I understand. I don't have any permission to do anything about it. And a lot of what happened with NLP was people took permission to go out and manipulate people for their own benefit.